Welcome our speaker for today, Debra Penrod. She is a valued member of the Pottstown Historical Society and is well known throughout the community for her very many volunteer activities. While browsing the internet the other day,
which means it must be true,
I came across some information about this amazing woman. She had a very interesting wedding day. She was married at an altitude of 14,000 feet in a sky van. Now this is the best part. The new couple and the wedding party parachuted from it to Earth at the ceremony.
They're all coming down all right?
She's here. She's a representative of the Aircraft Owners of Pennsylvania.
It's the AOPA, Aircraft Owners and Pilots.
And pilots.
Pottstown, or something like that.
Association.
Well, she is a support network, and it's a strong advocate of aviation and of the Pottstown Airport. Now, if you add to this her skydiving, her world travel, her flying career, I would suggest that this adventuresome woman with us today is a modern-day version of an Amelia Earhart.
Yeah, she got lost.
She's still here.
Now we're going to have some local history. Thanks to you. Following her presentation,
This is an extra one here.
there's free magazines about history. If you take one and enjoy it, please turn it back so we can pass it on. And then we'll have refreshments in the dining hall, to which you, of course, Deb, are invited. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I can start talking, and presumably the picture will come back. It went away again. How many people here have ever held a pilot's license? All right. I'll be trying to be careful of my full hour. Please, no gasping compared to what that would have been in the 60s. It's changed a little bit. And one last question. Has anybody here made a skydive? Tandem? You got to do that too. Any military bailouts here? I run into those once in a while. I'm going to be zipping back and forth here between the advance button and yes?
My son is a fighter pilot.
Very good. Very good. Which is a perfect time for me to mention, I originally volunteered to do this presentation about 3 years ago at the Pottstown Historical Society because I was talking to some folks at the society about the old Jacobs Aircraft Engine Company here in Pottstown and just behind the society building, and also the circumstances of how we came to get 2 airports in the 19464 zip code. And the irony to me was that pilots all around the world know about Jacobs aircraft engines, but that appreciation for how central Pottstown was to that industry many years ago is just sort of dissipated. And especially newcomers aren't familiar with it at all. Now, as far as you're a jet pilot in the family, I am not a trained historian or scholar. I am not an airplane or power plant mechanic. I'm not a technical person of any kind, as you just noticed. I do not have a commercial license. I've never flown a twin engine, a jet, or a helicopter. I am non-current, and I am low time, with as little time as with very little time pilot in command. In other words, in comparison to my pilot friends and to many family members, I'm little more than a pilot wannabe. Comparatively speaking. Truthfully, I just as much prefer to look out the window and watch all the other pilots fly. And as an add-on, I haven't even lived in Pottstown very long. I've been here about 8 years, so this is basically a labor of love by an amateur pilot who has a lot of time on my hands. I've relied on a lot of summaries, other sources for this. I've done very, very, very little original source documentation. That's a project for another day, or a better historian than me. To advance here. How am I going to get you from this picture of 1892 survey map in Pottstown, the Pottstown Iron Company Works, to a picture of my airplane? Stay tuned. Buckle your seatbelts, remain seated, no smoking, and enjoy the ride. Emergency exits. After the local iron forges of the 1700s led to these massive works and steel mills in the last 1800s, other amazing things in technology was also being advanced. For example, the business of the times was actually bicycling, and then it became cars, and then it became motorcycles. The connection between these technologies and aviation is very, very tightly woven, tightly connected. Sort of like, to use an aviation analogy, it's as tight as the connecting flight schedules at Atlanta Airport. Bicycle company sales began to suffer when cars came to compete for consumer dollars, forcing Pottstown's largest bike manufacturer, Light Cycles, to diversify into other work, including auto parts. It made perfect sense because cars also required a lot of really finely machined widgets, and the bicycles of the 1890s were very finely machined pieces of equipment at the time. Light company quickly got ahead of the game in the auto parts business, and they found a guy in Pottstown on Beach Street who developed an aluminum casting process. Now, I don't know what that is exactly, but it made it the cheapest, if not best, manufacturer of a box for automobile gear differentials, about 1903. Light also tried out their own horseless carriage. At some point, they even moved into a building in Pottstown that had been previously owned by the then out-of-business, very, very, very fancy luxury car company, Chadwick. Light may or may not have made parts for Chadwick. I haven't figured that out yet. Chadwick operated in town from 1905 to 1916 and had managed to finagle a large grant from Pottstown after they made threats to leave town with their manufacturing plant. And that was a couple of years before they collapsed in their own economies, in spite of the grant money. Some things never change. Light tried out motorcycles for a while. Then they owned the very innovative Merkel's motorcycles. You've all seen, I think, pictures of the guys around. You may even have one on the wall here somewhere about the guy with the Merkel bike. They did that for a couple of years, from about 1908 to 1910, before the Merkel business ended up going out to Ohio after being bought up by another motorcycle company. Some things never change. And then Light got into motorcycle parts. They even dabbled in making an entire aircraft engine of their own, not just the parts. And this is what I've been told. Is that, first of all, it's an amazing old picture. Okay. Notice, if you can, the bicycle tires down there buried in the grass. The skids that the tires are on, that it also slides along on, and the seat over the skids, which is where I think the pilot actually sits with the engine in the back. This is called a push or a pusher configuration. The engine pushes the airplane along instead of what they now do, which is generally pull the airplane along. The caption refers to this as a light engine. And basically that reference is taken from the Limerick Township Historical Society publication. But it's definitely early. It's pre-World War I, and if Light was making an engine that early, they were ahead. They were ahead of the game. There are so many aviation nuts like me, and many small and large aviation museums around the country, that if all I did was spend like a zillion hours going around and asking and looking and researching, I'm sure I'd be able to get a lot more information on this aircraft. But meanwhile, it's just it's a great picture. Let's see. Let me grab. So some notes here. Period of time, 1903. You know, the competition for the first airplane is crazy. The Wright brothers didn't just come up with it like out of the clear blue sky. They were in a manic race with other aviation engineers. Gliders had already been handled. They did a very early glider, but it was a crazy scene. The country, the entire world was airplane crazy, aeroplane crazy. That is, pilot crazy. They were celebrities. In addition to Orville and Wilbur, there was Glenn Curtiss. There were contests and huge prizes, parachute jumps, air shows, air races, wing walkers, barnstormers, daredevils, everything in those old movies, those great old movies. And this was all going on in Philly, Reading, Bluebell, New Jersey, Allentown, Harrisburg. But notice I didn't say anything about Pottstown, so hold that thought. But there was a bit of manufacturing, like I mentioned, at Light Foundry in Pottstown. And in fact, we know there was some flying activity in this area. I have a picture on the next slide of the Grand Aerodrome at, let me make sure I have this in order, of an aircraft at Mill Park. Mill Park is thought to have been taken in during World War I. Mill Park sits now where Memorial Park sits. It was originally part of the Pottsgrove Manor estate. There was a racetrack there. There was enough room. There was a racetrack for cars and then later horses, and there was also an airstrip back there. I don't think I know exactly why. I don't think I know why the golden age of aviation is supposed to have ended in about 1925, and I don't want to blame the lawyers because I am a retired lawyer, but it definitely had a lot to do with improved technology, safety concerns, commercializations, regulations. It started to become a slightly more organized activity. But make no mistake, the world was still very crazy about aviation. One author has called it air-mindedness. And that was sort of a religion or a philosophy, a belief that many of us still hold, that technology in the air would make the world a better place. That's why we now have Voyager satellites outside the solar system. That's why we have impeccable weather satellite photographs to follow track hurricanes. We have rover pictures from Mars, and we have drones that look for lost kids and forest fires. By the way, on the slides, I think I mentioned the beginning of airmail, beginning in 1925 or thereabouts. At this time, the government's support for private company transport of airmail was introduced by Herbert Hoover and other policymakers to ensure the short-term success of commercial aviation until public opinion, public confidence, technology, and safety could generate actual passenger revenue for the business. Another government support of an unsustainable industry. Some things never change, or just tremendous foresight on the part of the government at that time. But it's also, the airmail system was also proof that every government action will have unintended consequences. You know how, have you ever been bumped from a flight because somebody else got your seat instead? Beginning in the 1920s, when the fees were set up for airmail, a beginning airline company could get $300 for a 200-pound passenger on a cross-country flight. Well, that sounds like a deal, $300, right? They could get $1,800 for a 200-pound airmail load. So, Bear, I'm going to call him Mr. Barr. Very successful Pottstown businessman, was right in there, like just as soon as Light Foundry got it, he bought out Light Foundry about 1931. And he may have done so because he was this great business visionary, or because he had too much cash sitting around in the Pottstown Iron Bank, or whatever it was. He may have had great plans for aviation, but one possibility is just that by 1931, shortly after Light Foundry took over Brownback, they were probably foundering desperately under the stock market crash of 29. And so Barr buys it in 29, and you know what's coming next? Barr dies. Before I go on, stop the action here. My husband Come on in. I've already told them I'm not very good at flying, so.
You need to take the chair maybe that corner.
Yeah, pull that chair over here, sweetie. He's an excellent furniture mover, too. The Tiger designation you see on the ad for the Brownback engine led directly to the name of the most famous airplane ever used, which was the Cub, which was eventually designed and sold, built and sold by Piper. The Tiger was used in a Cessna aircraft. Didn't quite work out, but one configuration or another led into another change, or another, like garage tinkerers and engineers and inventors and husbands. They're all like the same. They just keep working on it and working on it, and several years later, the Piper J3 Cub was born. Actually, I think it started off as a Taylor craft, but it was a Pennsylvania aircraft, essentially. And then another sidebar. 3 years ago, remember, these aircraft are from 1929 and 1930. When I did this project 3 years ago, I learned that there was one Brownback C-400 Tiger that may have been in near flying condition at that point. The only other two known to exist are in museums. I tracked down an Italian aviation engineer by the name of Luigi, fell in love with him, and began working, he had begun working on restoring the engine about 2003 while he was working here in the States. I talked to him in March of 2015. He had taken the engine back to Italy with him several years ago when he returned from his job in the U.S. and may have actually flown it shortly after I talked to him. And I told him it was just so romantic that an engine from Pottstown had been transferred to Italy, restored by a young engineer, and that's just an impact from Pottstown's aviation industry that most people just are completely unaware of. You want to be my button pusher, honey? That's okay. Okay, so back to 1929. Two things are happening. Jacobs, who's operating as a airplane parts manufacturer, airplane engine manufacturer, operating out of the Camden Airport, gets an actual airplane engine approved by the feds back in February of 1929. And that was as big a deal then as it is now. It's no small amount of work. And the engine is a 7-cylinder radial engine. That's a picture of it right there, that pretty little thing. And then Jacobs also sets up as a PA corporation. They move into Philly for a bit. And in 1932, we're getting local here now, back to Mr. Bear. He's just acquired, Light Foundry, but he dies. Light Foundry is now in liquidation. Local history buffs, how did Mr. Barr die? He owned the Bar Arcade at Charlotte and High, where that parking lot is now. He was up on the skylight and fell through, crashed to his death, died 5 or 7 days later from tetanus. Can you imagine? I worked for a pharmaceutical manufacturer, a vaccine manufacturer. An airplane crash is not as tragic to me as a death by tetanus. After Barr's death in March 1932, Light Foundry's old longtime customer, or patron, their patron in the words of the times, Jacobs Aircraft Engine, because after all, nobody owns them anymore. Remember, they've gone out of business. Barr bought them. He's dead. There's this. So Jacobs Aircraft Engines in Philly buys them. They'd done some work for Jacobs, and they didn't want to lose their supplier. And this is a headline from March 1932, reporting that Light has been leased to Jacobs. Now, to put this all in historical context, because this is the History Committee, notice it's a 1-year anniversary of the Lindbergh baby kidnapping. This is when it's happening. I still haven't figured out, Doler die casting is somehow involved in all of this corporate exchanging and rights and licensing and manufacturing, but I haven't figured that out yet. The information's out there, there's just too much information. So it's 1932. Things are moving along. Jacobs is in town. They settle in, developing and improving their engines. This is the building over on Queen Street. And by the end of the 30s, Jacobs is selling engines in 26 countries. We are a global industrial center. Long after the steel industry had already made it their hometown, they were powering 4 and 5 place cabin. They were powering more 4 and 5 place cabin aircraft during this period of time than any other engine in its class. There will be no discussion for me on engines. The following information is Greek to me. Compression, 5.3 to 1. Displacement, 35 to 528 square inches. Bore size, 3 to 4.7 inches. Smoke, 2.5 to 4.7. RPMs, 2,500 to 3,500. Their horsepower range from about 180 the big 1929. By 1938, it was up to 300 horsepower. By it got bigger in the 40s, but a lot of that was licensing work. It wasn't their own invention. Again, these are going to be some more pictures from the manufacturing facility on Queen Street. Some of these pictures were donated to the Historical Society by family members of former employees. So if you've got any old pictures up there in the attic or in the garage or in the basement somewhere, don't throw them out.
Are you with the Historical Society?
I am. I'm one of their crazy volunteers.
The link that you mentioned about dollars, I don't want to interrupt, but we had a speaker in here a couple months ago.
Oh, okay.
He was a teacher. Remember him?
Yes, I should.
He has that link
Brown
information
does.
about dollars and...
Like
Jarvis.
Foundry and Jacobs and all that.
Yes, he does.
Yes.
Joe Brown, what was the man's name, you remember?
No.
I'll get it from you later. That'd be great. That'd be great. Again, some interior shots. These are some of the aircraft that the Jacobs were being used in the late 30s. Let me catch up with my notes here.
Mike Snyder.
Okay.
Mike
Yeah,
Snyder.
I know Mike. In fact, Mike has sat through this presentation. Some of the aircraft that the Jacobs aircraft engine was being used in, pre-war, civilian sales, there was a local airline company in Kentucky. They had 7 cities. They had 3 of these airplanes. They were Cessnas. They were powered by Jacobs. The plane had started off, if you can imagine this size and this shape, they'd started off as a single engine, and it didn't really go very far, very fast, very reliably. So they added 2 Jacobs on it, and it took off. It did great. The Bobcat, is this the Bobcat? This is a Bobcat, thank you. This is a Bobcat, used a version of the Jacobs, and it was also referred to as it was a UC-78 Bobcat. It was also referred to as the Bamboo Bomber. Now, it wasn't actually a bomber, but it was such a cute name. It was largely wooden, and it's just a good nickname for any airplane. Bombay Bomber. And then it was also used on, this is a Stearman. Stearmans can be recognized by any number of features by most pilots, such as the forward stagger wing and the position of the pilot behind those wings. Front seat just barely under the canopy of the wing. But I recognize a Stearman because someone usually says, hey, there's a Stearman. Like Curtis. Also from the color scheme. They tend to all typically be restored in this old Navy color scheme, right? Or Army. One of the military services. Although there's one guy locally who's had his done up in a John Deere green or something. But many of them are done in this color scheme. I don't know if it's authentic or not. These were all trainers. Well, these were trainers. This was a commercial plane. Jacobs was also put into a lot of other trainer planes. This is the Canadian Royal Canadian Air Force. Business is picking up for Jacobs, right? There is a war coming on. They know it. By 1939, they've got a contract to make hundreds and hundreds of engines and airplanes. Airports were necessary. In the 1920s, America was still very largely rural. Getting from one airport to the next was sometimes a bit of a challenge. How do you find it? How do you know where they are? They used incredible, incredibly complicated compassing and visual landmarks. Radios finally came around sometime in the 20s, but I don't think I could have figured those out. Every pilot's nightmare is either the airport isn't where it's supposed to be or you're where it's not supposed to be. Although the good news is sometimes when you look down, there's the airport. But now to find them, we have all kinds of fancy charts and GPS and computer programming. I will show you a few screenshots from those materials at the end of this. But early on, air marking was how you got from here to there. And it was a well-accepted practice with mariners. You had lighthouses, you had channel markers, you had beacons, and other navigation and safety aids. So why not airplanes? And they did. They painted information on rooftops, water towers. They stacked up rocks, especially out west, in the big distances out west. They stacked up rocks, painted them different colors. They dug ditches with arrows that pointed where you were supposed to be going. They used insecticide. Who knows what insecticide they were using to kill the vegetation, to spell out how many miles to wherever it was that you were heading out to. And Pennsylvania was a leader and instrumental in encouraging other state aviation communities to do these markings. Air marking was started before the war, and then the war comes, and then they, whoever they may be, decided it was too helpful to any potential enemy flyers. So the air markers were all destroyed, or disrupted, or obscured, or painted over, or covered up. They were redone after the war by an all-female department of aviators within the Aviation Bureau, and that is a tradition that is now carried out by a group known informally as the 99s, the International Federation of Women Pilots. It is no longer necessary, but I'll show you a picture later on. The air marking that they do is just beautiful. They're compass roses, and it's a tradition that's pretty cool to continue. Pardon my back. Local airports. Finally, we're going to get a local airport. The airport came first. The airport came before Jacobs, but I didn't have to do this in chronological order, so I didn't. The Pottstown area entered the air age in June 1927 when two pilots from Allentown, Mr. Miles Ether and Mr. Wayne Geary, landed an OX-5 Eagle Rock biplane on a dairy farm in Limerick, and 19464 Aviation was born. Mr. Geary really liked the looks of that property. By the way, if you've ever flown an OX-5, that's a big deal. I never have, but there are clubs, like OX members. It's a big deal if you've ever flown. The property was the Walter Zamborski Dairy Farm, and I have a picture of it here. Before it was turned into an airport, shortly after Mr. Geary purchased the property, about 1928. And another story starts here too. There was a really geeky 10-year-old kid who saw that landing on the airplane on that first landing. Ran over, knew something was going on, heard the engine problems. His name was Gabby Renninger. Remember that name? Okay, you're going to hear that name again. Anyhow, the barn became a hangar before it was torn down in the 1950s. But after a slow start in 1928, the Limerick Airport actually became a celebrity, very shortly after that. I'll describe about that later on. These are some of the workers who were there. Geary, Zeller, Don, Kunkel, Aitchitz, Rhodes, Hoffman, Klink, Ludwig. Some local names. And recent enough that, for the most part, they still have family or descendants in this area. I keep looking at the clock, which still says 9:30. I was talking about airport markers. For the non-pilots, I'll have to explain. Airports all have an identifier. It's a secret code. And it actually isn't secret. Every single airport code has an explanation behind it. But for the most part, a lot of those explanations have now been lost in history, and they just seem a mystery. The Limerick Airport down on the ridge. PTW. This is the official identifier for what is now called Heritage Field. It was also previously known as Pottstown Limerick Airport. It was also previously known as Pottstown Airport. The PTW is because it was the first Pottstown, PTW, Pottstown, airport in the area, so they called it PTW. It was actually never called Pottstown. You never call it Pottstown Airport now, please. Never call it Pottstown Airport now, because you'll be at the wrong place. Just to further confuse it, it is in Pottstown, PA 19464 zip code, but it's in Limerick Township. Which is why at one time it was called Pottstown Limerick Airport, or why today we say Heritage Field at Limerick. Because nobody knows where Heritage Field is, nobody. And you'll still hear pilots call it Pottstown Limerick. Other identifiers, okay, Philadelphia's pretty simple, Philly, BLS, Boston. If you've ever checked a bag, ABE, you're wondering, where did that come from? It's because until 10 or 15 years ago, it was called Allentown Bethlehem Easton Airport. I still call it ABE Airport. CMH for Columbus was called Columbus Municipal Hangar when the airport was invented. CRW, well, they just picked out some letters. CRW, Charleston, West Virginia. DCA, District of Columbia. Makes sense. EYW, Key West. FCC's got some rules. You can't change it. You can't start anything with a W or a K. I think those are reserved for TV stations or radio stations or
Radio.
So Key West was called Key West. They just left off the key and called it Key West. And then November 47 happens to be the identifier for the Pottstown Municipal Airport, also known affectionately as the Walmart airport, in case you don't know. Okay, if you don't know the area, a lot of people end up at one or the other where they don't mean to be there. Even with modern GPS, they think they know where the airport is. And fortunately, the same flight school operates out of both, so they can usually figure out by the look on the face of whether or not they're supposed to be there or not. Let's see what else I have here. We're getting into the 30s. Pottstown, Limerick is licensed as a commercial airport, meaning somebody can pick you up there and drop you off somewhere else and get paid for it. It had been recognized as an airport, just you couldn't pay to get there and back. This is a picture of the early field farms as an airport. I think the date on this is, I don't know, it's early. This picture will tell you how aviation has changed. This is the airport, and don't get hung up on whether this is ridge going this way or ridge going this way. You can see that the farm is still there functioning. The farm buildings are still functioning as the hangar. See the circle out in the middle? There's a windsock there. There are no runways. This is back when the airplanes were still so fragile and so susceptible to wind. You didn't land in whatever direction the controller told you to, because there was no controller. You always landed into the wind. So if the wind is coming from here, you land from here. If the wind is coming from here, you land from here. It's just a very, and you'll see this in some really old war movies. Yes,
I grew up there, and my best friend lived in the farmhouse that you showed, and her father was Wesley Nice, who crashed.
Yes.
And they talk of when you're in these Piper Cubs or whatever, that you would turn your airplane 45 degrees and you would come in sideways because the wind was blowing so hard.
Kurt does that. I stay on the ground. But that's just to get it coming in the right way. Crabbing. So anyhow, so the airport was then sold by the original purchaser, Mr. Geary, who turned it from the milk farm into an airport. And it was sold to Wesley Nice. Now, is that the most handsome guy you've ever seen in your life? I'm sorry. He was a flight instructor. He purchased it in 1945, and guess what happens? He dies in a plane crash. He died over the airport practicing aerobatics before he went down to compete in Florida.
She was outside and heard the crash, and she didn't know what it was, but everybody was shushing her into the house and wouldn't tell her what happened.
But anyhow, his wife, Betty, takes over and runs it successfully for quite some time. In 1952, she sells it to Jacobs. But, you know, remember, by this time, Jacobs is like kind of only half in business anyway. It was probably some kind of like it's probably a corporate perk for one of the executives. They were like, you know, laying off to give them a job to run the place for a while. Frank Cisco had been a manager. He'd been around in the industry in the area for a while. There was a well-known financier in that same family. So who knows? I doubt that it was an arm's length deal. It was described at the time as for the benefit of future expansions of the Jacobs manufacturing site, but it just never worked out. Some things never change, right? During the 50s, they got some paving. Paving's a big deal in airports. Runway extensions, lights were added. Lights are a big deal in airports. Yep. By 1968,